Good evening and welcome to the Bexley Library. We're happy to have you this evening. My name is Leah and I'm a new associate librarian taking on some of the local history projects. So I will be at a table in the back if you would like to see if your home is eligible for a Century Home sign. We have those and some information about our upcoming genealogy and house history programming. So now I'm going to turn it over to Zach, who will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming out to the Bexley Public Library. My name is Zach. I'm the programming librarian here. Really quick, just a quick note on how tonight's program is going to run. This is a hybrid model program, so we're so happy to have you gathered here at the library, but we also have an audience online at home. So after Larry's presentation, when we get to questions, if you don't mind raising your hand, we will come around with the mic. That way those joining us online can hear what is asked in the room. Tonight we are very lucky and grateful to be joined by Larry Helman. Prior to his retirement, Larry Helman was a partner at NBBJ, where he managed an extensive number of major planning projects globally. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in 1970 and a Master's of City and Regional Planning in 1972 from The Ohio State University. He and his wife, Kay, are the parents of 2 Bexley High School graduates. Larry is very active in the Bexley community and has served on many committees and boards, including the Bexley Historical Society, Southwest Bexley Steering Committee, Tree and Public Gardens Commission Board, Bexley Education Foundation, Board of Governors, and Bexley's Architectural Review Board. I will turn it over to Larry. Please join me in welcoming Larry Helman.
Yeah, my knees still work, enable me to get on the stage, so that's a good thing. A couple of housekeeping things, then we'll get underway real quick. Bexley Historical Society is pleased to be in a partnership with the Bexley Library regarding the Century Home program. And also, we have a partnership with the Bexley Architectural Review Board. Their staff advisor, Karen Bogert, was instrumental in helping to put these shows together, last year's show and this show. She is right across town at City Hall at an Architecture Review Board meeting, so can't be here. So but she will be absolutely reviewing this video tonight. So if I could, I would like you all to say, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen. And she'll hear that and go from there. Thank you for that. Also, because we're an amazingly nonprofit group, so there's a little donations thing in the back, and don't hesitate. It's small, but it'll hold a lot of bills. That would be nice. And then a statement out of the French Revolution, let them eat cake. So there's cake afterwards for everybody. And then also want to say hi to our online people, and then 2 other quick things, questions at the end. And while this is about Main Street, we'll talk about some other things as well, but it may not cover all of your favorite spots on Main Street, at least not in one evening at one point in time, but we'll give it a shot. So last year's talk was on the history and evolution of Bexley's residential neighborhoods. This one focuses on a single street, about 0.6 of a mile, Bexley's East Main Street. Tagged differently because this one says the ever-changing canvas, because unlike our residential areas, they haven't changed a whole lot. The houses have changed inside, but basically the character remained. East Main Street has changed dramatically over the years, matching up with services and needs in the community. So, agenda. First, I thought it well to share maybe some observations about how do you even begin to think about history? How do we begin to think about 150 years and make sense out of that? And then moving from that to what it means to own land, what it meant back there, what it meant in history, and how that moves forward today. And then we'll move into East Main Street itself, and then vignettes and stories, really focusing on 3 uses: groceries, gas stations, and restaurants. So if you're looking for a small segment on papagallas and so forth, might not happen, but we'll move on from that. So quickly, just an observation. It's funny because when we think of history, it seems like history was in black and white because all the photographs are black and white. And yet, obviously, these people lived a life in full color as well. And so when we think about that, like here's an old picture of the cottage where our home as the Bexley Historical Society. Here's a little picture of an old picture of a front entry to a Bexley house, but they're 3 months old. I mean, so just thinking about them in black and white is not enough. And then we think about 150 years, and I tried to make sense out of this in terms of generations. So my grandfather was born roughly the late 1880s, and then I could trace through all of the generations, my folks, us, my own kids and my grandkids, but that's not going to get you out 150 years. That's a long time. But it takes you, and so while I may be able to make some sense out of 1887, I can't make any sense out of the year 2187, you know, another 150 years. And there's some that might say, well, we'll even be around. Well, we won't be around, but we'll, you know, with climate change and nuclear issues and so forth. But, you know, people back then faced bubonic plague, and they faced, you know, their worlds didn't look that bright as well. So we press on and with how we think about times. But if we think about the good old days, I'm not sure exactly they were all that good. All kinds of things changed over time, but it was tough to move ahead. Disease was rampant, and yet we look at today, and since even 1990, the incidence of childhood infant death has reduced by 40%. So while we get a lot of bad news and things going, there are amazing things that continue to happen as we move forward in time. And then I think back and my own time when I was slightly younger than my grandson here in the front, and the things that were kind of a part of my world that were important to me. And, you know, I'm old enough, and some of you will remember when the family bought the first console stereo. You know, the big lid opened up, and the turntable was down in there, and the sound looked fantastic, because it came out of both sides. And I was a little strange kid because I like listening to Barbra Streisand. But I had my little GE transistor radio with the little square battery, which some of you remember, held it up like this. Black and white TV. I was a scout, so it got me out of town. Compass, flashlight, so forth and so forth. Well, all those things were really terrific, but who would have guessed that then today, the iPhone, which is only 17 years old, does all those things and even more. And so it just suggests that the speed of change is pretty massive out there. And then, of course, the big question about AI. Good thing, bad thing. We can't do anything about it. And yet, AI has also been equated to what it meant to discover the telescope and the microscope, because what both of those two instruments did was to open up a world we had no real understanding of. The celestial world and how far it is, which we still don't know. I mean, it's just massive and it just goes on. It's almost incomprehensible. And then the microscope, a world that we couldn't see, but becomes instrumental to really understand. And so to some degrees, as we always focus on discovery as human beings, and what AI is then capable of doing is searching vast amounts of data that can find relationships between things we could never discover by ourselves. So we would hope it's ending up being a good thing, and it won't be like Hal was in 2001. And it's like, David, I'm afraid I can't do that. I can't open up the portal. We all remember that movie. So, so we're hoping that is. But the takeaway point is really this. The future isn't what it used to be. And so it will unfold. We'll have to be part of it. We will help create that future, just as we all participated and helped create the Bexley's ever-changing canvas. So hold on, we head into the future. And one other point about AI, it's interesting on the other side how some of that virtual reality then plays into history, because we visited the African American Museum in Cincinnati, and you put on the virtual headsets, and you are on the bus with Rosa Parks. And the driver's telling you to move on back. You look around, and the other people are moving, and you're seeing, and the whole thing comes very real to you. And you understand the experience in a far different way than reading about it or analyzing it in terms of some things. So we move on with that kind of stuff. But I think the other takeaway, and another little analogy, we just got back from Ireland, barely 33-hour return flight. But anyway, because it was a tour, I was a little concerned. We'd have all these people we'd deal with, and maybe that was going to be okay. But the people ended up being the best thing because we traded stories. And then you discovered that the Celtic people didn't have an alphabet. So they couldn't write anything down. They couldn't hold their stories in anything other than their stories, than the verbal, oral stories that they held down. And so we all create story. We trade our stories, and it becomes part of history, and we all become the part of the history of our sweet little town called Bexley. So now let's ground this conversation in the land. That's supposed to be a joke. This is kind of another thing that sets the picture, if you will, a little bit. For most of recorded history, there were the 2%ers, and then there was everybody else, the serfs, the peasants, and so forth. And so the royalty owned all the land. They had the ability to have the financial resource, support an army to protect it, and all of that, and so forth, and so forth. And so the American lucky, divine providence, whatever you want to call it, when the time came to occupy and take care of an entire continent, it was a hard thing to take over on part of it. Europe, everything's jam-packed, so you could, if you had an army, you could move around, you could do a variety of things. But here you were with this massive piece of ground. The Indians, of course, occupied the land. They did not have a concept of ownership. They thought that was silly. How do you own nature? How do you own the air, the water, and the land? They were wrong, unfortunately, because people figured out how to own that land. And part of that became the nature of being able to survey, divide it up, and create it as a product, sell it back and forth. So the Jefferson saw that as being a major opportunity, and he called it the engine of liberty, landed farmers. And so if you were in Europe at that time, the thought of having your own piece of land, your own cow, your own horse, your own future, it was yours to do something with, and it was your life to make it or break it, had immense appeal. And it probably attracted those that were risk takers or had a bad enough circumstance that they wanted to leave where they were and come here. And that, and many would say that was kind of elemental to the American spirit and entrepreneurship. The other thing about that was and so it became land for the common land, or for the common man. But that allocation program was a Thomas Jefferson program, and in 1798, and it was the Relief for Refugees Act, French refugees, which makes no sense to me. But at any rate, when I look at my abstract, and James Madison, Jefferson signed it, so did James Madison, not the abstract, but the act. And the land passed down from big pieces to smaller pieces to smaller pieces, and ended up with a single-family lot, which we now own. So a guy named Francis Gazine, John Armstrong, David Deshler, that may be a familiar name because John Deshler lived in Bexley, Deshler Hotel, you may remember. And he bought the land for $5 an acre, so hundreds of acres for that in 1802. David Nelson Sr. and Jr., that's a familiar name because of Nelson Road, Nelson Park. And then he sold land to the Barrs, Sam and Elizabeth. Elizabeth is well known because she built the Sessions House, and part of Sessions Village was on land that she owned. And then it passed through a few other things before it got down to the Charles Hansberger, who was a builder-developer. And by that time, that thing had been chopped up, and ended up being a single-family lot. And, and yet, the time frame across that makes a difference because, as we'll talk about here in a minute, the lot sizes were different in terms of the needs of the residents at that point in time. And so this is a map we've used last year. You'll probably see this again a few times. This represents Bexley's neighborhoods and really development periods in time. And Bexley grew from, in the map, on the left side is Elm Creek, at the top Livingston, or I'm sorry, at the bottom Livingston, at the top the railroad track, and Gold off to the right. So the lavender area at the bottom was Capitol, basically 1875 and onward. The yellow area, big yellow area, was a big massive development by the Alfred Drexel and John Bullitt, Philadelphia guys, rich guys, who created one big template, country homes for country gentlemen. So those became the templates, but then after that, it was subdivision heaven, and just away you went, the blue areas, the orange areas, and so forth, and every doggone thing got calculated. So the area around Cap, the lots were bigger, and they were bigger because you had to have you might have to have a horse, you might have chickens. We still have chickens sometimes. So that was, you had a bigger garden and so forth. But of course, over time, the lots got smaller. And did they get smaller? And so the point of this is that if you look at Main Street across the middle of that image, it's not like somebody came along and set aside and said, you know, this would be let's hold these 15 acres for a shopping center, or let's hold this for a whatever, and so forth. Didn't happen. It all really disappeared into single family, except for some of the western end of things. The other thing that is, of course, a transition across that 150-year period is how goods got sold and handled. And you can read the slide, but basically it's evolved and continues to evolve. And if somebody like my grandson can figure out what the next step of evolution, he will do well as well. So we'll see how that works. But, you know, back then, the early days, you know, good morning, Mrs. Mitchell. Good morning, Miss Williams. How are you? What would you like today? Well, I like a couple cans of this and some flour, and you load it up, and away you go. Vast change from Costco. And amazingly, you could go to the gas station, and you'd have, this never happened to me, but maybe somebody saw this, where they would come and fill your gas, and they would take care of you. Vast changes in it. And then the first gas station, and we'll cycle back on this, there was a guy named Holtzman that owned the property northwest corner of Parkview in Maine, and he owned the Holtzman piano stool factory, which is where the Kroger's is now. And he saw change coming, so much so that he put a gasoline station on his front yard. A true capitalist, as it did. And then this is an interesting chart, and spend a minute or two on this. It's kind of interesting because 5 basic uses across the top. Gas station, grocery, drugstores, banks, and restaurants. And at the start, you know, gas stations, you bought it in jars and you added in, but that changed over time. Grocery stores were plentiful, and everybody was represented. A&P, Piggly Wiggly, Kroger's had 2 spots, of course. We'll cycle back on that. A bunch of different stores. But then the gas stations picked up, and by 1950, there were 10 of them. Does anyone want to venture a guess why there were as many gas stations in 1950? Hint, Route 40. Route 40. And for those of you that, I lived in Dayton for some length of time, and we dropped my brother off at Ohio State. And it was very common. You'd drive the country, you'd get to Springfield, you'd slog through Springfield, maybe you'd stop at Howard Johnson's, get ice cream, and then you're back in the country and you arrive again, and so forth. And so leaving Bexley, heading east, you headed back to the country. So that's why we ended up with motels, that's why we ended up all the gas stations. The grocery stores continued to reduce, and I'm sure we all know which grocery chains survived. Ate them all up, ate every one of them up. Drugstores were a local enterprise, generally speaking. There's some congregation, but then when that got, when you started to aggregate the uses, you ended up with just one. Banks happened in first one was 1938, Ohio National Bank. And my theory with that is that banks were always expected to be downtown, big, solid, secure places, massive, impressive lobbies, and just a lot of aura wrapped around to that. And so it took some risk to say, well, maybe they won't think this small little building here will be safe or the vault will be strong enough, not sure. But the primary takeaway from all of this is that the grocery stores went down for a while to zero. We'll talk about that. But the restaurants went straight up. And that says something about the future of the city, so hold that thought. I'm not going to go through this list. We know them all. There's some gas stations missing here. They were all there, Texaco, Mobile, so forth and so forth. They were all in place, and far longer list of restaurants as well. So with that as kind of a baseline, let's move to some vignettes and some stories here about uses along our Main Street. And some of these illustrations come from Edie Mae Harrell, who some of you may not know, but she founded the Bexley Historical Society. Great lady, and quite an artist as well. She upfitted our cottage with all the displays and so forth. And some of her watercolors are based on photos that she changed. So here's a watercolor representing the sitting on the Capitol lawn, looking out across Main Street at the barber shop that was across the street. It was the only building standing. Fine, reputable, students on one side, women on the other. Well, the actual photo is a little different because the guys are playing mumbly peg in front of the thing, so she couldn't bring herself to putting that into the rendering. So let's move on. We'll talk about groceries. And again, we're not going to talk about, not enough time to talk about everything. So let's talk about groceries. Okay, a fooler for you. Okay, why am I showing the Drexel Theater? Well, Drexel Theater's first life was as a grocery store in the 1900s. And actually the theater is a little bit of a, like this, because the theater is only that part of the theater is only 21 feet wide, which is the storefront. But if you know the theater, you walk back to the neck, and then all of the theater stuff was added on the vacant ground that was behind the storefront, where all the seats are and so forth. But you never really sense that it's not all a theater. So at any rate, the Drexel was turned around in 1937. 1937 was an Art Deco period, of course. And now has, in 1991, it became part of Kappa, so preserved, and it's got its 3 venues, and so well, that's all really good. Paul's. Paul's is a absolute gem in the city at the time it was around, and it basically was the Amazon of its day. It had gourmet in-house bakery. It had it smelled of jasmine tea and cinnamon and coffee. Open 24 hours a day, 4 delivery trucks, everything you could wish for. Paul Foltz, who opened it in 1930, he passed on in 41. His wife found a new husband who was willing to help in the store, so they kept it for a while, hung on for a while. The Beards had it for whatever that's worth, and they actually delivered during the 1978 blizzard, but it was a great institution. And one was the last remaining grocery stores with Tarpe's and Kroger's at that point in time. Speaking of Tarpe's, I could find almost nothing out about Tarpe's. Very hard. But I remember we lived here when that opened, and we had high hopes for it, even though it had the world's probably ugliest building. It was just a big blob there. But it didn't last long. And they also tried to do the restaurant, and that didn't last long. So, as you know, it wasn't until, well, the site's vacant today. That's part of the future of East Main Street. It's amazing to have vacant property on Main Street to rethink about on our ever-changing campus. So we got this guy. We got this guy in 2016. And a little backstory on Giant Eagle. Three guys in 1928 in Pittsburgh thought, let's get in the grocery business. So they did, and they called it Eagle Grocery. It lasted a couple years, and maybe they got bored, or maybe the money was too great. They sold to Kroger's, of course. But then in 1931, they thought, we still want to do the grocery thing. But since they had signed a non-compete, they couldn't use the word Eagle anymore, so they decided to call themselves Giant Eagle, which was pretty clever on their part. And they came to Columbus Market when Big Bear faded, and they bought 9 Big Bear stores, and the rest is history. At any rate, we got our 30,000 square foot spot here, and overall, they employ about 32,000 people. So now let's move to gas stations, and some of this is going to be geared towards the older folks in the crowd, so be history. But at any rate, so some of it will be a quiz. So this is the northwest corner of Parkview and Main. This is where the little gas station, the one that the Holtzman put in his front yard. Does anyone remember the guys who ran this Shell station? Dorsey and Reynolds. Ralph Dorsey and Jack Reynolds. Jack was the tall guy, smoked a pipe all the time. Ralph could have passed for Santa Claus. He was just this roly-poly, wonderful friend guy. And they would come out, they would do your car, and they'd do everything. And it was nice to have, when's the last time you had a relationship, well, I don't mean it that way, a friendship at a gas station. Doesn't happen anymore. So today, of course, and what you also discover with the changing canvas, gas station, bank, restaurant, because the parcel size kind of lend themselves to that kind of swapping. So that's a bank. Wentz's, a little bit on Wentz's. This is not a gas station, but we're going to talk about the one that's next door. But this is a good time to talk about Wentz's, which was also a grocery at one point in time. 1925, soda fountain, Doc Hayes. I don't know how many people remember Doc Hayes, who was the pharmacist there. Interesting man. We'll talk more about him later. 250 deliveries a day, 5 motorcycles, closed in 1989, and graders then filled that spot. But the point of the story is, does anyone remember who operated the 76 station, Pure Station, that was next to Wentz's? You know who it is. Nick Sensi. Anybody remember Nick Sensi? Nick Sensi, and he also ended up operating the Sunoco station up on Cassidy. And wonderful human being. He would actually, I think one time our daughter had some car issues, and he closed his shop down to go help her and to get her car running. He closed his shop down. He's a great guy. But he had an interesting way of fixing cars, because great human being, kind soul, but he swore like a sailor. And so he would swear a car into repair. He would just swear at it until it finally ran right. So, and of course today, that also is an office building. Another Art Deco building, Jack Teeter's Station, 1930, Art Nouveau. This was where CVS is today. And it survived for a while. It seemed to have lost its little teepee, but that then disappeared over time. And then where was this Texaco station? What's the building used for now? Which one? Huh? The building off to the far right is the library. That's the big hit. Yeah, Istanbul Cafe, or Istanbul Restaurant. That's the current use of that building. So again, you see the swapping back and forth. How about this building? Anybody know what this building turned into? Huntington Bank. Bingo. Now you're getting the drill. This was on the northwest corner of Roosevelt and Main. And the guy that operated this was Tracy Stanton, if you remember him. He was a good guy too. So at any rate, memory lane. And then the Texaco station next to Dairy Queen, which I still miss, but we're getting a Katzinger's in that building, so that's a good one. Sidebar. So early on, maybe I'll touch base on a little later, in the early parts of Main Street, let's say the 20s to the to the 30s, everything was kind of there. There were 2 schools, there was a church, city hall, post office, university, kind of tight little knit stuff. And so the church was Christ Lutheran Church. But one of the issues they ran into, we talked about this last year, was that when the Sunday school was massive. I think it had hundreds and hundreds of kids. Amazing. What a time. But the kids had to cross Route 40 to go to Capitol's University Hall to go on the 4th floor for Sunday school. I can't imagine anything more fun than being on the 4th floor to have Sunday school. That would have to be so exciting. So it was time to do an addition, bought the 2 properties to the east of them, hired a guy named Melvin Frank to do an addition. And so he did the addition, and just some ground rules when you would add on to a church. Number 1, the new building's not going to be any taller than the existing one. That wouldn't feel right. And number 2, you got to line up the first floor. So that band across the bottom there, above the bottom windows, was the first floor. But they needed 3 floors. So in order to make that work, you had to push it into the ground, and the 3rd floor, and in the building you can kind of touch the ceilings. So what's the point behind the story? Well, this isn't about a church at all. But Melvin Frank then was asked by Don Casto to design this new concept of a shopping center out on Broad Street called the Miracle Mile, Town and Country. And so Melvin went on he never did another church, but he did a lot of shopping centers over time. So when you look at the church, you can remember Melvin, and you can drive down Broad Street and think of that too. The original Village Hall, 1927, there were 2 patrol cars, a motorcycle, and a fire truck. The fire truck caught on fire, and the village constable would go on vacation. He would take one of the cars with him, so the community would be down to 1 car. But the point behind this story, who in this room has stepped foot inside that old village hall? Now you're wondering, what was I, 3 years old or 4 years old when this happened? No, the fact of the matter is, for reasons that I can't determine or can't be found, the building was actually physically relocated, hauled down Main Street to Cassidy, up Cassidy, across the railroad tracks. Margaret Road is 1 street south of 5th, and that's the building. And it has this front on it. And so I stopped in one day, and I'm just going to ask if I can. I said, can I walk in that building back there? It used to be our old village hall. Yeah, go ahead. And so I walked in it, and just a spectacular building, of course. So at least was able to get in front of you and say that I've been in the old city hall. So there you go. Restaurants. Talk about restaurants here a little bit. And the first of these, Willard's. And I'm sure most of you remember. Who remembers Willard's? Who ate and written? Yeah, there we go. Cool. Okay. Willard's, his name Willard Wendt, W-E-N-D-T. And he had a restaurant at Kelton in Maine in 1926, moved to Wentz's building in 1927, Wentz and Wendt. We'll talk about that. And then 1934 built this building, used half of it, and then basically it closed in 1988, was Touchstone Cafe, if you remember, to help folks learn skills. Fisherman's Wharf tried it for a while, demoed in I think 2005. What was the best meal in the place? What did you order when you went there? Roasted chicken, right? Roasted chicken was the thing. But in thinking about it, you can't, some of these things you can't make up. So here's Wendt and Wentz in the same building. And so I had to write this down because I could never remember this. So we might wonder whether Wentz went to Wentz Willard to eat or whether Wentz ever invited Will or Went for ice cream at Wentz's. So we don't know, but we're just checking that stuff out. Menu, if it's legible up there, probably not. This was back when he was in the Wentz building. So you younger folks in the room can imagine. Let's say I can get an entire meal for what, 40 cents? That's pretty good. And it was a nice building, but it's gone. This is a bizarre one. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with this. Again, the Art Deco period. It's kind of like architecture gone wild. And so designed to be modeled after a champagne glass. And it's seated about 18, done by the Thesaurus family, a Greek family who have done a bunch of this stuff. One of the investors was an owner in the Miramar. So they're coming out to this new suburb and trying something pretty cool here to see if they could. And it didn't really work pretty well. It had 18 seats in 1938, and eventually gave way in 1968 to Cochrane Drugs, which right now is another restaurant. IHOP. IHOP was built because of Route 40, right, because of Route 40, because you had to, before you could leave town, you get your pancakes and away you go. The first one was in California in 1958. Ours was built somewhere in the late 60s, not sure when it was converted over. For a little factoid, they make 400 million pancakes a day. No, a year rather, 1.1 million a day. That's a lot of pancakes. This one is, of course, the Holiday Boutique. And then a crowd favorite, the White Castle, which some of us miss. That went from 1930 to 1981. And when we first moved here, I know one night I think it was scraping wallpaper, and I went down, it was probably like 10:30 at night. So I thought, yeah, I'll stop at White Castle. And I walk in, and my first assumption, because the jail was behind this, and my first assumption is, my God, they let these guys out of the jail to get hamburgers, and they're going to send them back to the jail after they get their hamburgers. That was the strangest crowd in there that I think I've ever seen. But then we had neighbors, the Greiners, Barb and Tim, and we discovered our children were in the same grade, so we got holes in the fences, and they invited us over for dinner, they had crystal out and just sort of fine china, and Tim comes in with a silver platter from the kitchen, loaded up with White Castles and fries and onion rings. So that was our welcome to their family. And then, who remembers the Bobby Sox? Bobby Sox. And it was a great idea to have, in the lower level, to have a spot for kids, an activity space for kids. But somehow it didn't seem to work. Anyone want to gather a guess why it didn't work? I'm not making, yeah. Who? Why didn't it work? Okay. I wonder sometimes because you had to go in the place, go down the stairs, see if anyone else was there, and that was a big risk, because what if you went all the way down there and there's nobody there, and you'd have to come back out. But it was a great concept and was never repeated. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's get this figured out. That's Giuseppe's. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's Giuseppe. Thank you. Feel free to participate in the talk. That's fine. That's just great. This is primarily to set up Pizza Plus that started on the other side of this building. But I thought it well to just stop for a moment. This is where that Teeter gas station was, the Art Nouveau thing. And this was Revco before CVS bought them out and kicked them out. And I'm sure most of us remember going to Kroger's there. Yeah. And when you went to Kroger's, am I the only one that the floor would go, the tile would make noise when you walked through the store. It was kind of an unusual store. And then, of course, when they tore down the piano factory, Kroger's was gone, and CVS did the switch, and away we went. But the real story was Pizza Plus. little niche on the east side of that store. And I don't know when they started. I just hope they keep going. And of course, this is Rubino's in 1954. This is Rubino's in 1972. This is Rubino's in about 2000. And this is Rubino's as we know it today. And before I get into the last one of these things and wind this whole thing down, I thought we might ask some questions here before we wrap this thing up, make this a little special. So one of the things I just didn't include in the talk are specialty stores. Who remembers what specialty stores, women's stores and so forth, that were in Bexley on East Main Street? And just yell them out. Right. Right. Yeah. Acorn, right? Yeah. Youthland. Yeah, I mean, a bunch of amazing stores. And when you think of retail transitions, how we really lost something with those kinds of stores. Personal, a school closet, you know, you had a relationship you had with it, and somebody really helped you out. It felt special, it felt unique. You know, all that's just kind of gone. Do we remember, that's an easy one actually, this is a softball. The northeast corner of Cassidy and Main before it was a hair salon, what was that? Post office. It was the post office, right. What was the shoe store? Right. Good. Okay, those are pretty good. Well, the story to end on the on the vignettes is the only one that ever made it on national TV. And most of you know the story, some of you may not. But at any rate, let me advance it forward. Let me get my facts right here. So in 1937, a guy named Ted Lindenberg, and Ted Lindenberg was, his family owned, his dad owned a military regalia firm, McLilley's or something like that. And they made military insignias and stuff, and no one would buy this stuff today. But they made a lot of money. And if you're familiar where Goodale turns up onto Lincoln, there's that Mediterranean house in Grandview. That's where they lived. But at any rate, he had a hankering in 1935 to build a theater. Again, kind of an Art Deco kind of thing. Had a split screen, so mirrors and whatever that was all about. Neon Bexley on top of the thing. Just a really magnificent building. And of course, for a while it worked, and then it became kind of an arts film, and then it became less than an arts film. And so there you are, and it selected adult features, and it just was, and it also, at this point in time, the trees were long gone. This is kind of an old picture. So it was not only sold dirty videos, but it had no parking, no landscaping, and it was all concrete on the outside. However, there were a ton of residents that said, well, all of a sudden we really like that store because we don't want the McDonald's that was planned for that site. And so that made it to, and all kinds of issues. I mean, unfortunately, I was on Planning Commission when this went through, and the building was constructed material called Drive It, which is a fine material. CSG is built with Drive It. And so somebody he said, you know, it's a cheap building and blah, blah, blah. So he actually brought a sheet of Drive It to punch his fist through to show how flimsy this building would be. But at any rate, Jay Leno, of course, had a field day with this building. And of course, at the end of the day, it didn't survive anyway. It didn't have a drive-through, and it wasn't going to get a drive-through. And so it today is a Chipotle, so one of the 23 restaurants. And I'd be remiss if I didn't cover Sweet Little Bank. Hasn't changed at all. The little Ohio National Bank, done in a very tasteful, again, 1938, it kind of feels 1938, and still serves that purpose over and over again here. So maybe to kind of wrap this up, focus on the ever-changing canvas and landscape here. And so back to the west side of Maine versus the east side of Maine. The west side of Maine had those bigger parcels, the farm parcels, which were able to be reused for bigger things. And Capitol is the big blob on the south side. And of course, what has been happening is that Main Street has also been transitioned back into a residential neighborhood, but of course not single family, but multiple family, stacked family. And so we've got Gramercy, we've got One Dawson Place, some great buildings, Parkview Arms you're familiar with, and we got this new guy coming in. And here's yet another question. Does anyone remember, this is the site of the Seminary Apartments, now gone of course, but what was it before the Seminary Apartments? What was on that site? Anyone know? Bullitt Park School. That was one of the first schools. And that's why it had the little walkway out the back so kids could walk to the neighborhoods back there. I think it was 12 classrooms, 6 a floor, 3 a side. And so that's why it was a big enough piece of ground to be able to do something with. So this is, I don't know what the final name's going to be, but this is called affectionately by some and less so by others, 2200 East Main Street. And I don't know the number of units and all, but to be some first floor retail and more restaurants and some office space. And it represents change, again, to that section of Main Street. If we look at the eastern section of Main Street, the lots are smaller. They don't have the big pieces because by the time that developed, there were, no one was worried about cows or horses or anything. So whatever the law would allow you to subdivide, that's what you did. But you've got a lot of things going on. I mean, we're really fortunate that we have a university. We're fortunate we have that yard space to work with, the main event and all the stuff. I mean, the amount of fun that's been generated and community that's been generated in that space is just outstanding. I mean, it's a beautiful, wonderful thing, and that's why it's the main street. And so a fuzzy picture here, and that's Elm Creek off to your the left of that image. And you can faintly make out a Capitol and the big thing. So what are these colors? Well, sometimes when you do planning and you're trying to figure out how to energize a space, you go through and you take a pencil and you animate, you color in those spaces that are animated, where people are outside, or where they're seen and they're moving about and so forth. This is not true all the way up and down the street, but that becomes kind of the goal, if you will. We've got more outdoor dining than we've ever had. We could use more. We could use more restaurants. But that becomes a system that you then improve over time. And there's a land use strategy 2.0 that's underway to focus on that and many other issues in Bexley, but certainly on Main Street to make it that kind of experience. But that intersects with yet another system, and that's that green thing going up and down. And that's the Elm Creek landscape and the trails, because we're fortunate to have land available along that creek for future use. We'll see what it is that could engage that creek. So you could have this walking environment that stretches back and forth. And that really leads to kind of the basic wrap up on this, if you will. And yet another story. I did a fair amount of work in China. And China at night, and in Taiwan and Beijing. And in Taiwan, most of the buildings are 4 or 5 stories, and the first floors are usually machine shops and all different kinds of things. The restaurants are above. And at night, the street just fills up with people. And there's cars mixed with motor scooters, mixed with couples holding hands. You do not dare change direction. You can't go, oh, my, because a motor scooter will take you out. But they, so this motor scooter goes by, and on this motor scooter, it says on the side, see and be seen, S-C-E-N-E. And I laughed. I thought, well, they can't spell. They don't know what that word is. And then I thought about it. No, they're exactly correct. See and be seen. Be part of the scene and enjoy the scene. So that becomes part of the future of our street, to where all of us, and no matter where you are in age or continuum, it's a place of community where maybe somebody recognizes you. And sometimes that's a bad term, but it's like sometimes we have all these encounters. We'll go to Harvest, we'll sit down, and there'll be 3 or 4 people in there. We'll be next to somebody at the bar, or you do it at Rusty Bucket or here. Hey, how you doing? You're catching up with people. Those are beautiful things. And if your kids are aging out of school events, and then now your grandkids are aging out of school events, you don't have that many opportunities to do that. So the see and be seen becomes pretty doggone important. And then last, if anyone have seen last year's show, I always like to end talking about future trends in housing. And if you remember last year, well, look at if you get bored sometime, the previous talk is Larry Helman YouTube. I got my own YouTube. Isn't that fun? And that'll cover the first part of this thing. But at any rate, so one of the things people look for, I think, anymore is security becomes important. Can I live in a place that's pretty secure? So here's a concept that's kind of interesting. It's having your own dragon on your building. And rooftop barbecue, no problem, but no pets. Pets would be a problem in this building. So, and then there's some folks that don't want Bexley to get too dense, would maybe wish we stayed single family universally overall. So are there ways that we can have single family lots, but they're vertical, and that you live in pods stacked up in the front? So just some housing thoughts for the future. And with that, I'm going to back up to a couple of slides, and we'll be happy to answer any or all of your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
I was wondering, when we lived in Bexley, parking was always a problem on Main Street. Is that still an issue?
Yes. I can't speak for all the details but that's one of the issues that Land Use Strategy 2.0 is trying to address. And it has a lot of different components to it. One is, we think we've dodged that one, but the CODA would like us to give a dedicated lane to their rapid transit buses, which would take out all on-street parking. Well, we're not going to do that. We can't afford it. But is maybe having a system. I mean, part of it is consumer behavior, because everyone wants to park right there. Sometimes there's spaces available, but they're a block away, and so there's a little concern about doing that. So maybe there's some notification system that says, like at Easton, and that's different, but green spaces available here, not sure. But that said, behaviors are going to have to probably alter some, and the more that we can walk to these places, obviously, the better. So that does become an issue, but the project 220 will have a big parking garage associated with it. And if you're familiar at all with like Lane Avenue, Lane Avenue, you've got to park in a garage to use the restaurants. So those kinds of changes are coming a little bit. Or you can do your golf carts. We can get, you get like 2.5 golf carts in one, no, not quite in one spaces, but yeah, so that becomes that is an issue. Yeah.
There's a new building being rehabbed there at Grandin in Maine, one away from Carroll Dennis there. And it seemed that everything's being built out to the street. Is that Bexley's new philosophy?
Yeah, hopefully there'll be some, I have to be thoughtful here. Because there are what's called Main Street guidelines, and the guidelines talk about varied setbacks and that there needs to be something given back to the street. way too many buildings across, my opinion, way too many buildings across Columbus are being built flat onto the sidewalk. No space for tables, no space for much of anything. And they give nothing back to the street. It's a hard edge. And parts of it can come to the sidewalk, in my opinion. Parts of it should be set back. There should be places that are recessed back, where there should be some green spaces recessed back. So these buildings become friendlier and they become nicer, because after you have 4 or 5 blocks of built to the street, that street goes pretty quiet and not much goes on. So that's an ongoing discussion in Bexley. You noticed on that, see if I can get there. You noticed on this guy, the ins and outs. So at least one victory there to where there is a space. I'm not sure I've got a picture. No, I don't. The space in the middle goes back some, and there are ins and outs on the corners you can see. So it's not a wall. It's a varied wall. And so that becomes, in my mind, a pretty important design issue, especially because if you go to, strangely enough, if you build just to the sidewalk, you got to cut out about 1/3 of your tree canopy on that side because the tree's right into the buildings. So, yes, that is, the answer to that is yes. Any other questions or thoughts here? Yeah.
So on that whole McDonald's thing, who led the charge on that? I've heard rumors that it was like Frank Elmer and Robert Lizzie.
No, you mean the antis?
Yeah, the anti.
I think Rob Livesey was the chairman of the OSU Architecture School for a while. He lived behind there. I'm not sure he was still there when that happened. You know, and I'm not sure I want to venture too far down that thing. I think there was a concern, that's life, there were concern about, there wasn't a drive-through. Drive-throughs remain illegal in Bexley. I hate to say this, but I think we've come some way on that about diversity, but I think there was concern about who would use it and who would work there. And where would they park? They might park on Sherwood, or they might park someplace else. They would park there. And it was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous argument, but we wish the world had completely moved on, but we left some people behind. So that was one of the unspoken issues. So not a proud moment for Bexley. So any other questions or thoughts?
Well, Larry Helman, thank you so much.
If
What a
not,
wonderful
eat
presentation.
cake.
And, thank you again.
Thank you.